Can I play in exchange for food? The hoarse voice cut through the air of the Grand Symphony Hall like a rusty knife. The silence that followed was so heavy that it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the luxurious foyer. All conversation ceased. White wine glasses froze in midair. Heads turned in unison to face the source of this impossible interruption. A black woman of about 45 stood at the main entrance to the hall, leaning on a white cane that identified her blindness. Her clothes were irregular layers of worn fabric, an olive-green military jacket over a faded blouse, stained sweatpants, sneakers without laces. A worn wool cap partially covered gray hair that hadn't seen a comb in weeks. On her back, a worn backpack that seemed to contain all her worldly possessions. But what really caught everyone's attention was the violin case she carried in her free hand. An old case, with peeling leather and rusty clasps, as worn as its owner. "How the hell did that beggar get past security?" hissed a woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She wore a blue velvet dress that cost more than most people earned in 6 months. The event was the city's annual Philharmonic Society cocktail party, an exclusive gala where professional musicians, patrons of the arts, and members of the social elite gathered to celebrate musical excellence and raise funds for young talent. Tickets cost $500. The dress code was strict. And absolutely no one there expected someone like Claire Morrison to walk through those doors. Claire was 45, but she looked like she had lived 60. Her eyes, though blind, still had a disturbing depth, as if they could see things others couldn't. Her fingers, even dirty and with broken nails, moved constantly in intricate patterns, an unconscious habit of someone who had spent her entire life playing stringed instruments. "I just wanted to play," she repeated, her voice maintaining a strange dignity that didn't match her appearance. "Just one song. In exchange for a plate of food. Anything will do." The laughter began as ripples, then grew in volume until it became an orchestra of scorn. The sound echoed off the walls decorated with portraits of dead composers who would probably have been horrified by the scene. "She thinks she can play the violin," laughed a middle-aged man in an impeccable tuxedo. Trevor Hansen, first violinist of the local symphony orchestra and known for his arrogance proportional to his considerable talent. "I bet she found that case in the trash and thought it was worth something." "She probably doesn't even know how to hold the instrument properly," added a younger violinist, Natalie Park, 28, a Juilliard-trained virtuoso who had returned to her hometown to take up a prestigious position. "It's sad how some people live in fantasy." But there was one person in the hall who wasn't laughing. Professor Edmund Hayes, 67, a retired conductor and living legend in the music community, watched Claire from afar with an expression that no one else noticed, a mixture of intense curiosity and something that seemed almost like recognition. His eyes narrowed when he saw Claire's fingers move unconsciously, and a shiver ran down his spine. Those movements. That posture, even if bent by the weight of life on the streets. There was something there that his brain, trained for 5 decades, recognized, even if he couldn't yet name it. Claire remained motionless as the laughter continued, her head slightly tilted as if listening to music that no one else could hear. And indeed, in her mind, she was listening. She always did. Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Paganini, the ghosts of dead composers were her constant companions on cold nights on the streets. "Security," called an authoritative voice. Vivian Cross, 52, president of the Philharmonic Society and organizer of the event, advanced with the firm steps of someone accustomed to having her orders obeyed instantly. Her white Chanel suit was as impeccable as her reputation as an advocate for the arts and philanthropist. "Remove this person immediately. This is unacceptable." 2 security guards began to approach, but Claire raised a hand, a gesture so full of natural authority that both hesitated for a moment. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," she said, and there was something in her voice now that made the room fall silent again. It wasn't a plea. It was something closer to a promise. "Just let me play one song. If I'm not good enough, I'll leave and never come back. But if I play well, you'll give me food and maybe a few dollars." Trevor Hansen let out a shrill laugh. "I need to see that." "Vivian, let her try. It'll be better entertainment than the string quartet you hired." The comment provoked tense laughter. Vivian Cross looked from Claire to Trevor, then to the other guests who were clearly curious about how the situation would resolve itself. She was a woman who understood spectacle, and this, she acknowledged with a cold smile, could be an amusing story to tell at future dinner parties. "Very well," Vivian announced, her voice carrying the tone of someone granting an immeasurable favor. "Let's do this. You can play one song, just one. If you manage to play something remotely decent, I will personally pay for a full dinner at the hotel next door. But," she paused dramatically, "when you fail miserably, as we all know you will, you leave here and never show up at our events again." "Agreed." Claire nodded slowly. Her fingers were already undoing the rusty clasps on the violin case. What none of those people knew, what none of them could have imagined in their worst nightmares, was that Claire Morrison had been, 17 years earlier, the first violinist of the New York Philharmonic. A prodigy who had made her professional debut at age 16. A virtuoso who had 3 gold albums and had played for presidents and kings. Until one night, driving back from a concert in Boston, a drunk driver crossed the double line and changed everything. The accident killed her husband instantly and left Claire with brain damage that resulted in permanent blindness. And for a violinist whose career depended on reading complex sheet music, seeing the precise finger positions, making eye contact with the conductor and other musicians, that blindness was a professional death sentence. The insurance companies fought. The money ended up paying for experimental surgeries that didn't work. The house went to the bank. The career evaporated. And slowly, inexorably, Claire Morrison fell through the cracks of society until she hit rock bottom, the streets that were now her only home. But in all those 17 years of hell, one thing remained intact. Her fingers still knew every position, every vibrato, every harmonic from muscle memory so deep that blindness could not reach it. And the violin she carried in that battered case was not trash found on the street. It was a 1734 Guarneri del Gesù, one of the rarest and most valuable violins in the world, which she had managed to hide from her creditors. The only fragment of her former life that she still possessed. The instrument that had kept her sane during years of homeless nights, playing on empty street corners for coins, the sound muffled by the indifference of hurried pedestrians. Claire slowly opened the case, revealing the violin. Even covered in dust and neglect, even with the varnish cracked in places, the beauty of the instrument was undeniable. Several people in the hall, those who really understood violins, felt an inexplicable chill. "That violin looks too expensive for a beggar," Natalie Park murmured to Trevor, a line of suspicion crossing her forehead. "How did she get it?" "Probably stolen," Trevor replied dismissively. "Or a cheap replica. Those toy instruments look real sometimes." But Professor Hayes had approached, his eyes wide. He recognized that violin. Not the specific instrument, but the shape, the style, the grain patterns in the wood. And when he saw the almost invisible initials engraved near the bridge, CM, his heart skipped a beat. Claire Morrison. The name exploded in his memory like a rocket. Claire Morrison, the prodigy who had disappeared from the stage 17 years ago after a terrible accident. Claire Morrison, whose last performance he had attended and who had made him cry with the sheer emotion of her interpretation of Chausson. "My God," he whispered, but the sound was lost in the excited chatter of the other guests. Claire lifted the violin, positioning it under her chin with a movement so natural, so perfect, that any experienced musician would recognize it as the result of decades of practice. Her hands found the right positions by pure instinct, her fingers dancing lightly over the strings as if greeting old friends after a long separation. And then, just before she began to play, she smiled. It was not a happy or mocking smile. It was the sad smile of someone who is about to reveal a truth that no one is prepared to hear. If you're enjoying this story about dignity, hidden talent, and the transformative power of music, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out what happens when a woman the world has thrown away decides to remind everyone who she really is. Claire ran her bow lightly over the strings, producing a soft tuning sound that echoed through the hall with a crystalline purity that made several people stop laughing immediately. This was not the harsh sound of a cheap or poorly maintained instrument. It was the rich, deep tone of a truly exceptional violin. "What song would you like me to play?" Claire asked calmly, her voice directed at no one in particular. Trevor Hansen, still holding his wine glass with untouched arrogance, decided to turn this into maximum entertainment. "How about Ravel's Tsigan? It's a piece that every intermediate violinist knows. If you really know how to play, you should be able to do at least the opening part." The choice drew malicious smiles from the other musicians present. Tsigan was notoriously difficult, a 10-minute virtuoso piece that required advanced technique, physical endurance, and a deep understanding of the Romani style. It was the perfect choice to expose a fraud. "Tsigan," Claire repeated, and something in her tone made Professor Hayes take an involuntary step forward. She didn't seem intimidated or confused. She seemed nostalgic. "I haven't played that piece in years. But I accept." Natalie Park leaned over to whisper in Trevor's ear. She didn't even ask for a score. How is a blind person going to play such a complex piece from memory? That's ridiculous. "Exactly the point," Trevor replied with a cruel smile. "When she starts improvising out of tune, everyone here will witness what happens when people without proper education pretend to have talent they don't possess." Vivian Cross watched with a mixture of curiosity and growing discomfort. There was something about Claire's posture, the way she held the instrument, that didn't fit with the image of a desperate imposter. But she pushed the thought away. It was impossible. A woman living on the streets simply couldn't have the kind of training necessary to play Ravel. Claire took a deep breath, closing her useless eyes, a habit that persisted even after 17 years of darkness. And then she began. The first notes of Tsigan emerged from the violin like a whisper, almost inaudible, gradually growing in intensity. The introduction required specific harmonic and double-string techniques that only advanced violinists had mastered. Claire executed each one with a precision that instantly changed the air in the hall. Trevor's smile began to falter. This wasn't right. The bow control was too perfect, the intonation absolutely precise. It was as if she were listening to a world-class professional. Natalie felt her stomach tighten. She had spent months mastering Tsigan at Juilliard, and yet her performance had never sounded as effortless, as completely natural as what she was hearing now. Claire continued, and the music began to build in complexity. The wild glissandos characteristic of the piece flowed from her fingers like water, each note placed with the absolute confidence of someone who knew every millimeter of the violin's neck by unbreakable muscle memory. Professor Hayes felt tears begin to form in his eyes. He recognized that style now. The way she attacked certain notes, the specific vibrato she used in the lyrical passages, they were Claire Morrison's unique technical signature. No other violinist he had known in 50 years had exactly that combination of power and delicacy. But how? How was it possible that Claire Morrison, the lost legend of classical music, was here, blind and homeless, playing as if no time had passed? Vivian Cross felt the ground begin to move beneath her feet. She had organized this event for 12 consecutive years, always with the same speech about valuing true talent and supporting worthy artists. And now before her was an artist she had tried to throw out like trash, playing with a level of excellence that none of the paid musicians that evening could match. Claire reached the central section of Tsigan, where the gypsy rhythm exploded into triple and quadruple strings that defied the laws of physics of the instrument. Her fingers flew over the strings with impossible speed, each note clean and clear, while her bow danced with absolute control over the wild dynamics that the piece demanded. "That's impossible," Trevor muttered, his wine glass trembling in his hand. "She can't be, no one plays like that without." But she was. And the more she played, the more obvious it became to all the professional musicians present that they were not witnessing luck or some trick. They were witnessing pure mastery, the kind of skill that took decades of intensive training and extraordinary natural talent to develop. Memories flooded Claire as she played. She remembered learning Tsigan at age 19 with her mentor at Juilliard. She remembered performing it at Carnegie Hall at 24, with her husband Thomas in the audience, beaming with pride. She remembered the last time she played it, 3 days before the accident that destroyed everything, on a European tour that was at the height of success. And she remembered every day since then. Of the sudden darkness that engulfed her. Of the doctors saying she would never play professionally again. Of the doors of the music industry closing one after another when they realized that a blind violinist was, in their view, useless. Of the money disappearing into futile treatments. Of the house being taken away. Of friends drifting away until she was completely alone. 17 years living on the streets. 17 years playing on street corners for coins, while pedestrians passed by without really listening, without realizing they were ignoring one of the greatest violinists of her generation. 17 years carrying that Guarneri like a sacred secret, the last fragment of dignity she refused to sell even when hunger bit deeper. The music grew in intensity, and Claire allowed all that pain, all that pent-up anger, all that injustice of being discarded as human trash to flow through the strings. The technical execution was perfect, but what really paralyzed everyone in the room was the raw emotion that saturated every note. Natalie Park felt tears running down her perfectly made-up face. She had spent her entire life pursuing technical excellence, but she had never been able to make her violin sing with that kind of emotional depth. It was clear now that technique without lived experience was like words without meaning. Trevor dropped his glass, which fell to the carpeted floor without breaking. His hands were shaking. All his arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a terrifying recognition that he was in the presence of someone operating on a level completely beyond anything he would ever achieve. Vivian pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart race. The implications of what was happening began to crystallize in her mind. If this woman was truly who her performance suggested, then Vivian had just publicly humiliated one of the greatest living artists. In front of witnesses. At an event supposedly dedicated to celebrating artistic excellence. Professor Hayes finally got close enough to see the details of Claire's face beneath the grime and wear of the years. And there, beneath the layers of cruel time and hard living, he finally recognized the features of the brilliant young woman he had known decades ago. "Claire," he whispered, but the sound was swallowed by the music that continued to fill every inch of the hall. Claire was approaching the climax of the piece, where Tsigan exploded into a final cadenza that demanded everything a violinist possessed: technique, stamina, musicality, and pure courage. Her fingers flew in patterns that defied the eye, her bow attacked the strings with surgical precision, and the sound that emerged was so powerful, so utterly devastating in its beauty, that several people in the hall began to sob openly. And then, impossible as it seemed, Claire did something none of them expected. In the middle of the final cadenza, she began to improvise, adding variations that did not exist in the original score, raising the technical complexity to levels that defied belief, transforming Tsigan into something simultaneously familiar and completely new. Only the most experienced musicians recognized what was happening. Improvisation in 20th-century classical music was rare, requiring not only absolute technical mastery, but also a deep theoretical understanding of the harmonic and rhythmic structure of the piece. What Claire was doing was the musical equivalent of a poet writing perfect verses in real time. Trevor felt nausea rise in his throat. He had mocked her. He had called this woman a fraud, a fantasist, someone who had probably stolen the instrument. And now she was demonstrating a level of virtuosity that made him feel like an incompetent student in comparison. The music reached its final climax, Claire attacking the last notes with such force and passion that the strings of the guarneri vibrated as if they were alive. And then, with one last chord that seemed to contain all the pain and triumph of human existence condensed into pure sound, she stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and deathly. No one moved. No one breathed. The whole world seemed to have stopped spinning. Claire lowered her violin slowly, her chest rising and falling with the physical exertion of the performance. Sweat ran down her face, mixing with the accumulated grime. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from sheer exhaustion after channeling such intensity through the instrument. And then she turned her head in the general direction of where Vivian Cross was standing, a small, sad smile curving her lips. "So," Claire said calmly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Was that decent enough for that plate of food?" It was Professor Hayes who broke the paralyzing silence, his hands coming together in applause that echoed through the hall like distant thunder. The sound roused the others from their trance, and gradually, hesitantly, others began to clap as well. But it wasn't the enthusiastic ovation that a performance of that caliber deserved. It was the tense, uncomfortable applause of people who had just realized they had made a terrible mistake. "Claire Morrison," Hayes said loudly, and the name fell on the crowd like a bomb. "You are Claire Morrison." The reaction was immediate and visceral. Several people pulled out their cell phones, typing frantically. Within seconds, faces paled as old articles, archival photos, and videos of historic performances appeared on their screens. The radiant young woman with dark hair in the videos seemed impossible to reconcile with the broken woman before them, but the eyes were the same. The way she held the violin was identical. "Impossible," Vivian whispered, her face draining of color. "Claire Morrison died. Or disappeared after the accident. No one has heard from her in 17 years, Claire finished calmly. 17 years since the world decided that a blind violinist was worthless. Since I discovered that all the love for art that these institutions proclaim only exists when art comes packaged in a convenient and marketable form." Trevor Hansen felt bile rise in his throat. He knew the name Claire Morrison. Every professional violinist did. She was a legend, one of the greatest virtuosos of her generation. Her Paganini albums were still considered definitive recordings. And he had just mocked her, called her a fraud in front of dozens of witnesses. I didn't know, he stammered, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. And if you had known, would you have treated me differently? Claire asked, echoing the same question Raymond Cole had asked months earlier in a similar context. But would you have continued to laugh at other street musicians who don't have recognizable credentials? Would you have continued to assume that poverty and homelessness mean a lack of talent and dignity? The silence that followed was oppressive. Natalie Park stared at her own $1,000 shoes, unable to find the words to justify her behavior. Then something unexpected happened. From the back of the hall, a young woman in her 30s approached, her professional camera still hanging around her neck. Isabella Chun, an award-winning documentary filmmaker specializing in social issues, had been hired to film the event for the Philharmonic Society's website. Ms. Morrison, Isabella said respectfully, I recorded everything. Your performance, but also everything that happened before. The laughter, the comments, the way you were treated. She paused. With your permission, I would like to include this in the documentary I'm making about missing artists and the system that abandons them. Claire turned her head toward Isabella's voice, and for the first time since she had entered the hall, genuine emotion crossed her face. Not anger or sadness, but something akin to hope. You were documenting this? Claire asked, and there was a note in her voice that made Vivian Cross feel the floor disappear completely beneath her feet. Yes, Isabella confirmed. I've been documenting arts charity events for 3 years, examining the disparity between what these organizations say they value and how they actually treat vulnerable artists. Your story is exactly the kind of evidence my documentary needs. Vivian felt genuine panic for the first time in decades. A documentary. Filmed evidence. Her name, her reputation, her entire carefully cultivated image as an arts-loving philanthropist, all of it was about to be publicly destroyed. Wait, Vivian stepped forward, her voice taking on a tone of barely concealed desperation. This was all a misunderstanding. We didn't know who she was. If we had known. Exactly, Claire interrupted, her voice gaining a strength that made several people recoil. If they had known who I was. As if my humanity, my right to basic dignity, depended on having a recognizable name or an impressive resume. Professor Hayes approached Claire, his eyes red. Claire, what happened to you? After the accident, we all looked for you. We tried to find you. You just disappeared. Claire let out a bitter laugh. You looked for the famous violinist. No one looked for the blind, broken woman in the homeless shelters. No one recognized me on the street corners where I played for coins. Do you know why? Because when you're dirty, when you have no address, when society decides you're invisible, you become invisible. Even to people who once knew you. Hayes swallowed hard, knowing she was right. How many times had he passed street musicians without really hearing them? How many times had he assumed that real artistic quality only existed on formal stages? Trevor took a step forward, his hands shaking. Ms. Morrison, I was inexcusably cruel. There is no excuse for how I spoke to you. I apologize, not only for my ignorance about your identity, but for treating any artist with such disrespect. Claire nodded slightly, accepting the apology without comment. But everyone could see that the words, while necessary, were insufficient to undo the damage done. Natalie approached as well, tears streaming freely down her face. I spent years studying your recordings at Juilliard. You were my hero. And I didn't recognize you. Worse, I was part of the crowd that ridiculed you. Then learn from this, Claire said calmly. Learn that talent and human value don't disappear just because circumstances change. Learn that the next person you despise may be carrying gifts you will never understand. Isabella continued to film discreetly, capturing every second of that transformation. In her mind, she was already editing the sequence, the initial humiliation, the transcendent performance, the shocking revelation, and now this moment of forced moral confrontation. Vivian realized she had completely lost control of the situation. Her attempt to expel an inconvenient beggar had turned into a public exposure of everything that was wrong with the cultural elite she represented. And worse, it was being documented for posterity. Ms. Morrison, Vivian began, her voice now carrying a forced humility that fooled no one. The Philharmonic Society would like to offer appropriate compensation for tonight's inappropriate treatment. Perhaps we could discuss a formal performance, remuneration, maybe even a residency position. Claire turned her head toward Vivian, and the smile that curved her lips was cold enough to make the temperature in the hall drop several degrees. Now you want to compensate me. Now that you know my name, my history, my documented value in the classical music market. But where were these offers when I was just a blind, homeless woman asking for a chance? The question hung in the air unanswered, because everyone knew the truth. There would be no offers. There would be no compassion. There would only be contempt and expulsion. Professor Hayes placed a gentle hand on Claire's shoulder. Claire, I know words can't undo what happened. But please let me help. You need a place to stay, medical care, resources. I have connections, I can. Professor, Claire interrupted him gently, your kindness is appreciated now. But it comes too late to change the fundamental fact that our world measures human worth by the wrong things. Isabella put away her camera and approached Claire. Ms. Morrison, my documentary will be shown nationally in 6 weeks. With your permission, I would like to do additional interviews, document your full story. The world needs to know not only that you are still alive, but what society has done to you. Claire considered this for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. Yes, she said finally. But not to get revenge on these specific people. To expose an entire system that discards artists the moment they are no longer commercially convenient. To show that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of Claire Morrisons out there, people with extraordinary talents that society considers invisible because they don't fit into profitable packages. What none of them knew yet was that the video Isabella was capturing would be just the beginning. In the weeks to come, Claire Morrison's story would become a viral phenomenon, forcing uncomfortable conversations about class, disability, artistic value, and the hypocrisy of elite cultural institutions. But at that moment, in that luxurious hall, as the city's social elite faced the cruel mirror of their own moral failings, Claire Morrison carefully stored her guarneri in its worn case and prepared to leave. The plate of food they promised me, she said calmly, you can keep it. I've lost my appetite. And with that, leaning on her white cane, she began to walk toward the door, leaving behind a hall full of people whose understanding of excellence, dignity, and human value had been permanently altered. Wait. The voice echoed through the hall with such urgency that Claire stopped halfway to the door. It wasn't Vivian or Trevor or any of the musicians who had humiliated her. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 17 years, but one she recognized instantly. Claire Morrison never gave up on anything without finishing what she started. Claire turned slowly, her face expressionless. From the back of the hall, a woman of about 70 advanced, leaning on an elegant cane. Perfectly coiffed white hair, upright posture despite her age, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through all social masks. Professor Judith Brennan, Claire said, and for the first time since entering the Grand Symphony Hall, her voice trembled with genuine emotion. Vivian Cross felt her stomach churn. Judith Brennan was a legend, former first violinist of the Berlin Philharmonic, mentor to 3 generations of virtuosos, and known for her sharp tongue and impossible standards. She rarely appeared at public events, and Vivian had no idea she was present that evening. I was in the private box on the 2nd floor, Judith explained, approaching Claire with measured steps. I only came because Edmund begged me, saying there would be interesting musicians to evaluate. She shot a contemptuous glance at Trevor and Natalie. He didn't mention that there would also be a circus of cruelty disguised as a charity gala. Trevor felt his face burn. Being insulted by Judith Brennan was like being disapproved of by God himself. Judith stopped in front of Claire, studying the face ravaged by time and the streets. You disappeared, she said simply. After the accident, you vanished like smoke. I looked for you, Claire. We all did. Not hard enough, Claire replied, her voice carrying 17 years of pain. Or maybe I just fell too low for people in ivory towers to see me. Judith nodded, accepting the accusation. You're right. We should have looked harder. We should have looked beyond the obvious surfaces. She paused. But now you're here. And you just gave the best performance of Tsigan I've heard in 40 years. So tell me, Claire Morrison, what do you really want from tonight? The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Everyone in the hall leaned forward slightly, awaiting the answer. Claire remained silent for several long seconds. Then slowly, a smile began to form on her lips. It wasn't a bitter or vengeful smile. It was something much more dangerous. It was the smile of someone who had finally decided to stop hiding. "What I want," Claire said calmly, "is to expose the truth. The truth about how institutions like this treat artists when they are no longer convenient. The truth about how many extraordinary talents are dying on the streets while salons like this celebrate artistic excellence with $100 canapés." She turned to face Vivian directly, and even though she was blind, the weight of her gaze made the organizer recoil. "Ms. Cross, you said this event is to raise funds for young talent. How much money was raised tonight?" Vivian hesitated, realizing too late that she was walking into a minefield. "Approximately $120,000. And how much of that actually goes to young musicians?" The silence was deafening. Isabella Chun, who had resumed filming, perfectly captured the moment when Vivian realized she was being publicly cornered. "Well, there are operating costs, of course. The hall, the catering, marketing." "Answer the question," Judith Brennan interjected, her voice sharp as broken glass. 20%, Vivian finally admitted, her voice barely audible. $24,000 goes to scholarships." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Claire nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "So you spent $96,000 celebrating your own generosity," Claire said calmly. "Meanwhile, there are violinists sleeping under bridges, pianists playing in subway stations for coins, cellists whose instruments have been pawned because they couldn't pay their rent." Trevor felt nauseous. He had attended that event for the past 5 years, always proud of his support for the arts, without ever questioning where the money actually went. "But here's what I really came here to do tonight," Claire continued, her voice gaining strength. "I didn't come here to beg for food or pity. I came here to expose the system. And Isabella isn't the only one documenting it." She reached inside her worn coat and pulled out a small device, a professional digital recorder, tiny but high quality. "I've been recording high-definition audio from the moment I walked into this room. Every cruel laugh, every condescending comment, every word you said when you thought you were safe in your moral superiority." The room erupted in contained panic. People looked at each other, trying to remember exactly what they had said, how they had laughed, what comments they had made that now seemed monstrous in the light of the revealed truth. "That's illegal," someone shouted from the back of the room. Actually, a new voice interjected, "It's not." A man in his 50s, elegantly dressed, stepped forward. "I'm David Kellerman, an attorney specializing in media law. And Connecticut is a one-party consent state for recordings. Ms. Morrison has every legal right to record conversations in which she is a participant." Vivian felt the world crumble around her. It wasn't just Isabella's video. It was professional, legally obtained audio evidence that captured exactly the kind of behavior that would destroy her reputation permanently. "But here's the really interesting part," Claire continued, and now there was a note of cold satisfaction in her voice. "This isn't the first time I've done this. Over the past 6 months, I visited 17 arts charity events in 7 different cities. Always the same story, organizations that claim to value talent, but treated me like trash the moment I walked through the door." Isabella smiled, immediately understanding the genius of what Claire had orchestrated. "And you documented all of them?" "All of them," Claire confirmed. 17 events. 17 audio recordings. 6 with complimentary footage. A systematic and unmistakable pattern of how the cultural elite treats artists when they don't come conveniently packaged. Professor Hayes began to laugh, a laugh of pure delight and admiration. "Claire Morrison, you brilliant, brilliant woman. You turned your suffering into social research. You set up an exhibition that no institution will be able to ignore." Judith Brennan also smiled, a fierce smile of approval. "And here I was thinking you had given up. But you were just waiting for the perfect moment to strike back." Claire turned to the crowd, her voice now carrying the weight of years of accumulated injustice. "Each of you will have a choice in the coming weeks. When this documentary airs, when the recordings are published, when the whole world sees exactly how you treat people you consider beneath you, you can deny it, you can defend yourselves, you can try to minimize it." She paused, letting the silence settle. "Or you can change. You can use this public humiliation as a catalyst to truly live the values you proclaim. You can transform these institutions into places that genuinely support artists, not just those who are commercially convenient." Vivian felt tears burn her eyes, not from sadness, but from impotent rage. She had been manipulated, exposed, destroyed by someone she had assumed was harmless. And the worst part was that there was no possible defense. Every word Claire had said was true. As for the Guarneri, Claire continued, stroking the worn case, many of you are wondering how a homeless woman has $1 million violin. The answer is simple: because I was given it. It was a gift from an anonymous patron after my performance at Lincoln Center in 2006. And when I lost everything else, I refused to sell it. Because this instrument reminded me of who I really was, even when the whole world forgot. Trevor approached, his hands still shaking. Ms. Morrison, I know that nothing I say can undo the damage. But I swear on my honor as a musician, that I will use this as a lesson. I will change how I treat people, how I evaluate talent, how. Words are easy, Mr. Hanson, Claire interrupted him. Actions are what count. So show me. Show everyone. Use your privilege, your position, your voice to defend vulnerable artists. Or your words mean nothing. Natalie stepped forward, her face wet with tears. I'll do it. I swear. I'll create a program at Juilliard, a support network for homeless musicians, something that really helps instead of just taking pictures for pretty annual reports. Claire nodded, accepting the promise without commenting on whether she believed it or not. Isabella approached, her camera finally turned off. The documentary will air nationally in 6 weeks on PBS. But before that, I'm going to release excerpts on social media. Your story, your performance, all of it. The whole world will know the name Claire Morrison again. And this time, Judith Brennan added, placing a hand on Claire's shoulder, we won't let you disappear. I will personally make sure you have housing, medical care, everything you need. Not out of charity, but because it's the least we should have done 17 years ago. Claire remained silent for a long moment, processing everything. Then finally, she nodded. Very well, she said calmly. But on one condition. Everything you do for me, you do for 10 other artists in similar situations. Not just famous musicians who have fallen from grace. Unknown artists who never had a chance to shine. Because they deserve dignity too. The entire room watched as Vivian Cross, president of the Philharmonic Society, faced the devastating reality that her carefully constructed life was about to publicly unravel. And that the only way to perhaps, just perhaps, salvage some shred of redemption was to fully embrace the transformation Claire was demanding. 8 months later, Carnegie Hall in New York was packed to the last row of the 4th balcony. It was no ordinary evening. It was Claire Morrison's first performance in 17 years, and the whole world was watching. Isabella Chen's documentary, Invisible Voices, The Real Cost of Excellence, had become a cultural phenomenon. Over 40 million online views, 3 Emmy Awards, and a wave of public outrage that forced dozens of arts organizations to completely overhaul their operating structures. Vivian Cross was not present that night. She had resigned as president of the Philharmonic Society 3 days after the incident at Grand Symphony Hall, when the viral video surpassed 10 million views in its first 48 hours. Her luxury events company lost all of its major clients in a matter of weeks. The headlines were relentless: elite organizer exposed as hypocrite in viral documentary, and the woman who laughed at a legend. But something unexpected happened in the months that followed. Vivian, forced to rebuild her life from scratch, began volunteering at an arts program for the homeless. Not for image rehabilitation, the cameras had lost interest in her. But because she had finally understood, through devastating public humiliation, what Claire had tried to teach her that night: dignity did not come from status, but from actions. Trevor Hanson was present at Carnegie Hall, sitting discreetly at the back of the audience. Over the past 8 months, he had completely transformed his approach to teaching. He had created a free mentoring program for young musicians from disadvantaged communities, using his own tarnished reputation as a lesson in humility. His social media, once full of self-promotion, now documented stories of hidden talents he was helping to discover. Natalie Park was on stage, part of the orchestra that would accompany Claire. She had kept her promise. She had established the Claire Morrison Fund for Artists in Crisis at Juilliard, which had already helped 47 musicians in vulnerable situations with housing, medical treatment, and performance opportunities. Her tears that night 8 months ago had been the catalyst for genuine transformation. Professor Edmund Hayes was backstage with Claire, adjusting the final details before she went on stage. His eyes shone with pride, but also with a deeper understanding of his own past failures. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Claire, now with clean, neatly cut hair, wearing an elegant but simple concert dress, smiled. The marks of 17 years on the streets were still visible on her face, deep lines around her eyes, a scar above her eyebrow from a violent night in a shelter. But there was something else there now. Not just survival, but regained purpose. "More than ever," she replied. Judith Brennan, seated in the front row next to Isabella Chun, watched the stage with fierce satisfaction. She had kept her word. Claire now had a comfortable apartment, access to specialized medical care, and most importantly, a platform to continue her advocacy work for marginalized artists. The lights in the hall dimmed. The murmur of the crowd turned to expectant silence. Claire walked to the center of the stage, guided by the muscle memory of hundreds of past performances, her Guarneri del Gesù, now professionally restored but still bearing the scars of her journeys, secure in her hands. "Good evening," she said, her amplified voice echoing through the historic hall. "Some of you know me from my previous life, before the accident that changed everything. Others know me from the viral video where I was publicly humiliated by people who claimed to value art." A nervous laugh rippled through the audience. "But I'm not here tonight to talk about my past or about revenge. I'm here to talk about the thousands of artists who are still on the streets, on street corners, in shelters, people with extraordinary gifts that the world chooses not to see because they don't come conveniently packaged." She paused, allowing the words to sink in. "Tonight, half of all proceeds from this concert, approximately $250,000, will go directly to the new national program for artists in crisis. Not to gala events. Not to celebrations of our own generosity. But to real housing, real medical treatment, real opportunities for people the system has abandoned." The applause was deafening. Claire lifted her violin, positioning it under her chin with that timeless familiarity. "I will play Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto in D major. The last time I played this piece was 3 days before the accident that left me blind. Tonight, I play it not as the young prodigy I once was, but as the survivor I have become." When the first notes emerged from the Guarneri, accompanied by the orchestra under the baton of a world-famous conductor, there was not a single person in Carnegie Hall who did not feel chills run down their spine. The technique was flawless. 17 years of mental practice and occasional street performances had kept her skills sharp in ways that defied logic. But it was the emotion, the depth of feeling that overflowed from each note, that transformed this performance into something transcendent. Claire wasn't just playing music. She was channeling years of pain, loss, humiliation, and finally, redemption through the strings. Each virtuoso passage carried the memory of cold nights sleeping on park benches. Each delicate harmonic echoed the loneliness of being invisible in a city of millions. Backstage, professional musicians, violinists who had spent their entire lives pursuing technical excellence, watched with tears streaming freely. Because what Claire was demonstrating transcended technique. It was art at its purest and most devastating. Trevor Hansen, sitting at the back of the hall, covered his face with his hands and wept. Not just for what he had lost by humiliating Claire that night 8 months ago, but for the realization that he had wasted years of his life pursuing the wrong kind of excellence. Technique without humanity. Virtuosity without purpose. When Claire played the final cadenza, that section where the violinist plays alone, without accompaniment, completely exposing their skills and soul, time seemed to stand still. Her hands flew over the strings with impossible speed, but each note was crystal clear, each phrase laden with meaning so profound that words became inadequate. And then, with one last chord that seemed to contain all the pain and triumph of human existence, she finished. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Then Carnegie Hall erupted in an ovation that made the walls vibrate. People jumped from their seats, applauding, shouting, crying. The ovation continued for a full 12 minutes, one of the longest in the hall's modern history. Claire remained at center stage, her Guarneri still under her chin, absorbing the sound like rain after years of drought. But it wasn't the validation that moved her. It was knowing that this moment, this performance, was changing conversations about human worth, about who deserves dignity, about how society treats its artists. In the days that followed, the performance went viral. Clips reached 80 million views. Articles in major publications explored not only Claire's triumphant return, but the systemic issues her case exposed. 3 weeks after the concert, the Philharmonic Society, now under new leadership, announced that it was completely overhauling its operations. 70% of all funds raised would go directly to artists. The annual event would be replaced by a series of free community concerts. And Claire Morrison would be named Artistic Director of Community Engagement. Vivian Cross watched the announcement in her small apartment, where she now lived on a fraction of her former standard of living. Something inside her, perhaps residual shame, perhaps reluctant admiration, made her pick up her phone and send a message to a number Isabella Chun had given her months ago. Ms. Morrison, I know I have no right to ask for anything. But if you need volunteers for the community program, I would like to offer my time. Not for public redemption. Just because I finally understand what you tried to teach me. The reply came 3 hours later. Show up at headquarters Tuesday at 9 a.m. Bring humility. Leave ego at home. Vivian smiled through her tears. It was more than she deserved, and less than she needed. Perfect. 6 months after the Carnegie Hall concert, Claire was back on the streets, but this time, not as a homeless person, but as the leader of a movement. The Invisible Voices Project now operated in 23 cities, offering not only emergency assistance but real opportunities for marginalized artists to perform, record, and develop their careers. Hundreds of musicians who had been invisible on street corners now had names, stories, and reborn careers. Claire's model was forcing the entire music industry to rethink how it identified, nurtured, and valued talent. On a cold November afternoon, Claire stood on a street corner in Boston where she used to play for coins years ago. But now she was there for a different purpose, introducing a young homeless cellist named James to a talent agent whom Isabella had convinced to come. Music knows no addresses, Claire told the agent, echoing the words her musical grandmother, Judith Brennan, had taught her decades ago. It only knows truth and passion. And when you have both, no lack of a roof over your head can disqualify you from greatness. James played, and the agent, initially skeptical, felt the same chill that everyone in the Grand Symphony Hall had felt 8 months earlier. Real talent, coming from an unexpected place, challenging all the comfortable assumptions about who deserved opportunities. Vivian Cross, now the program's volunteer coordinator, watched from afar. She had lost everything: status, money, respect from the social elite. But she had gained something she never knew she was missing: real purpose. For the first time in her life, she was doing work that really mattered, not for her reputation, but for real human lives. Claire sensed Vivian's presence and turned her blind head in her direction. Vivian, can you bring the application forms to James? He'll need documentation for next week's audition. The casual use of her first name, the implicit trust in the task, the recognition that Vivian was now part of the team, it was more than forgiveness. It was the kind of radical dignity Claire had championed from the beginning. Treating people not for what they did in their worst moment, but for what they could become when given the chance to grow. As the sun set over Boston, Claire Morrison, former prodigy, 17-year survivor of the streets, and now leader of a movement that was transforming how society treated vulnerable artists, smiled. She had set out to destroy Vivian's hypocrisy, but ended up transforming an entire industry. Claire had learned that true revenge is not retaliating against humiliation. It is achieving such a complete victory that your enemies have no choice but to join the cause they tried to destroy. The best revenge is to prove that dignity, talent, and human value never depended on addresses, bank accounts, or functioning eyes. They depend only on the courage to continue creating beauty even when the whole world insists that you are invisible. If this story of redemption, justice, and the transformative power of art has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that show that it's never too late to rebuild, that true talent cannot be erased by circumstances, and that sometimes, the people society discards carry the most extraordinary gifts the world desperately needs to hear.